Hi everybody. So this week I'm going to be posting several lectures to sort of finish up the entire course. And today, right now, this lecture is going to be recapping what our chapter on global theater, some of the highlights. It's very difficult to potentially talk about everything that this chapter discusses because it's rather immense, just in the sense of it being global theater. Okay, so first off, the author, Edwin Wilson, points out that theater is really global at this point, and it's global because the same reasons that we think about trade, commerce, and other elements of any kind of commercial venture today, that we really live in a global network where information, communication travels quickly. And so the same thing happens within the arts, that artists are influenced by each other across a global spectrum and not just limited to a nation state. But our book does sort of discuss and want to sort of trace back some other sort of lineages of performance other than, say, U.S. or Western-centered performance. And so our book begins with talking a little bit about Asian theater, and Asian theater in the sense that Asia, obviously as a continent, is quite huge, but three particular areas that are important in terms of the history of performance, and that is India, which really has some of the oldest performance traditions in the world, over 2,000 years old. China, which also has almost as old of ancient traditions and theatrical practices. And then Japan, that as early as 800 BCE had established performance practices. And today, even three practices remain quite active in terms of traditional theater in Japan, and that is No theater, Bunraku theater, and Kabuki theater. Now, performances outside of Asia that are definitely also important to take note of are performance traditions coming out of Africa, and Africa being not just a continent but a region, and the sort of sub-regions within Africa, and pre-Columbian Latin American traditions, and of course Native American, both North America, Central America, performance traditions. So all of these regions and ethnic and multicultural sort of performance traditions certainly influence global flow and also influence what global theater is today, as well as being intermixed now with Western practices, and certainly realism as well as modernism and postmodernism has reached out beyond a sort of European and American tradition and influenced other regions, and vice versa. That African practices, Native American performance ritual, Indian, Chinese, and even Japanese traditions have influenced Western performance. And I'll get a little more into that when I talk about some of the postmodern directors. So as I was mentioning before, global flow is really this sort of idea that theater and performance travels both out from where it's being performed and tours or goes to international festivals, as well as performance traditions from outside a particular region coming in and influencing a particular theater company or director or even playwright. And today there's definitely diverse groups all over the globe that influence contemporary theater. Some of this is apparent if you ever get a chance to go to an international theater festival. New York City has a huge international theater festival, but so do places like Santiago, Chile, Kampala in East Africa, the Edinburgh Festival, both the sort of large, well-established festival, and then the Fringe Festival also in Edinburgh. So international festivals in particular showcase global performance and showcase work that's being done all over. So these particular festivals aren't centered on their own region, but literally invite in global performance artists, global theater artists, global theater companies. So looking at a couple of particulars, I want to bring your attention to a couple of African playwrights. The first playwright, Ethel Fugard, who was actually is white because he's still alive today, but his work has been concerned particularly with political and social equality. And so he wrote a number of plays collaborating with Black actors, criticizing apartheid, and trying to affect change from inside his art. And certainly next week, when you all look at Ubu and the Truth Commission, that particular play by playwright Jane Taylor, but in collaboration with the Handspring Puppet Company, also looked to sort of reflect back on some of the atrocities of apartheid in South Africa, as well as the process of healing that any community that has lived through trauma tries to come to terms with. Another particular important artist coming out of Africa is Nigerian playwright Wole Soyinka, who also could be seen as a political activist in the sense that his plays are politically charged, but in addition to being a playwright, he is a poet, novelist, activist, and professor. And I've posted a link with a kind of interesting interview with him, fairly recent interview. So take a look at that. In terms of global theater, we could look at the world and sort of section it off into regions, and really every region in the world, theater happens. Theater happens because people want to bring a voice to concerns. People want to celebrate their own culture. People want to celebrate what it is to be human. And so if we look at the region like the Middle East, there's certainly been very active Palestinian theater. Now, not in Palestine, but Palestinians who have in the UK, in the US, and in other areas have created pieces that critique Israeli occupation, as well as many of the issues that are contemporary in the Middle East. There have been playwrights coming out of Syria and coming out of what has been labeled the Arab Spring, Morocco, Lebanon, Egypt, Tunisia. So all of these particular countries have artists who are creating work to discuss and think about what it is to be of that region, what it is to be in the world today with the complexities of politics. And certainly Israeli theater, which really is established in 1948 with the Israeli state, and theater coming out of that region, thinking about the identity of Israel as both a country and what it means to be Israeli. And our book discusses quite a bit about Russian theater and Eastern Europe theater, and of course Western Europe, theater coming out of France, theater coming out of Germany, theater coming out of Great Britain and Ireland. So all of these regions have contemporary practices, contemporary movements that continue to influence theater globally, as well as be influenced by other regions. And so two particular movements that come out of the 20th century that I want to briefly discuss have to do with avant-garde and postmodern influences. And really, postmodern just simply means after modernism, and it is particularly marked with disjointing of time, the collaging of imagery, the non-linearity of story. And then avant-garde, as a vocabulary word on your previous test, is sort of, in the forefront. So something that is anti-establishment, that is experimental, that is cutting edge. It's really the sort of definition of avant-garde. And both of these movements really come out of the 1960s. And we have two particular directors who helped chaperone that sort of that era, which we've already looked a little bit at Peter Brook, who continued to work through the 1960s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and was particularly interested in global theater and taking theater from the UK to other countries and regions and being influenced by particular cultures, specifically Indian practice, Far East Asia, Indian performance practices, and bringing them to theater in the UK. And then Robert Wilson, who is sort of considered the epitome of postmodern director. And really his work is I would say, it is influenced globally, but it has a certain aesthetic of, for lack of a better term, coldness. His pieces are about juxtaposing imagery, movement, sound. And I think I've included a few images in previous PowerPoint, as well as our book looks a little bit at Robert Wilson in a couple of different sections. And then we have the avant-garde practices. Avant-garde coming out of both a Parisian practice, but also coming out of a sort of post-1960s or middle of the 1960s practice. Everything from street theater to theater that rejected realism, theater that was interested in compiling and creating hybridity of form. So being influenced by Greek theater, but also being influenced by kabuki at the same time, or being influenced by a sort of in your face. And so then the next section I wanted to bring up was a number of women playwrights coming out of the UK that have been particularly important: Sarah Kane, Timberlake, Wharton Baker, and Carol Churchill. Now, Sarah Kane wrote a number of quite intense plays. Unfortunately, she killed herself, so we only have a certain number of plays up until her death. But her plays are really all about mental illness, as well as what it meant to sort of be living in the 1990s in the UK under Margaret Thatcher, but also in a world that sort of had no hope, as well as high unemployment. And so the youth of that era were angry and had no connection to what could be considered a future. So a particular theater movement that came out of that is called In Your Face, and that term comes out of a sort of angry, very raw, as well as theater that sort of didn't sugarcoat language. So that's what Sarah Kane came out of. And Carol Churchill, who's a bit older than Sarah Kane, who's actually still writing today, wrote some seminal texts that were really considered feminist texts in the 1970s and 80s. And she still writes today and has continued to develop. She looks at technology. In some of her latest work, she has a play all about clones, pretty interesting. And then newer work that's called Love and Information that we will actually be producing in the spring at Chaffey College. So if you're around, you should come check out that play, Carol Churchill's work. So another region that has certainly been quite influential in terms of global theater is Latin American theater. And I'm going to just highlight two artists, Augusta Boal, who is a Brazilian artist, director, theorist, who wrote a book called Theater of the Oppressed that really has become a sort of blueprint of a kind of theater that is both political and about justice, social justice. And Augusta Boal, as a Marxist who was very critical of both government and the sort of company, corporate owner and colonization, was actually jailed and tortured for several years, and then left Brazil and lived in exile for many years in Europe, and then eventually went back to Brazil in the mid-1980s, but continued to travel and perform and create work all over the world. And his work is still, it's studied by scholars, it's looked at by activists as a sort of blueprint for how to take theater and make it do something that's relevant, that isn't about illusion or isn't about a sort of middle class milieu, but is in a way performance that could potentially change social practice. Which brings me to Jesus Rodriguez, who is a Mexican playwright, actor, and activist, who is also considered a Marxist. And her work she performs today has certainly been on the watch list of government because she critiques things that happen. She critiques the injustices that she sees in her community. She critiques the exploitation of laborers in Mexico. She critiques religion, government, other kinds of social constraints, everything from class, gender, race, sexuality. And so I've posted a short performance piece by her that has the English translations being projected. So anybody who doesn't speak Spanish, hopefully you can read what she's saying. I wanted to post another video, but I couldn't find English translation, which I actually was lucky enough to see her perform, which is a dialogue between Darwin and God. It's really hysterical. She plays both parts. It's quite brilliant. So that's Jesus Rodriguez. And so then finally, our book sort of ends up coming to Canada and Australia, and these two sort of outlier countries connected to the UK, to Great Britain, but also that seems to slightly mirror some of the movements in the US. And certainly Canada had what was considered a little theater movement, and both countries have theater that has arisen and connected to university. And then both theater companies also, or both countries, have theaters that have been created that are specifically interested in a contemporary issue, like a LGBTQ theater or feminist theater, or theaters that are interested in creating and producing plays by and about First Nations or Aboriginal Native people. And so I think that's why our book sort of puts those two together, is because of those movements that are somewhat similar, and also that both both countries have a fairly extended history of performance art. And so this really wraps up what I was going to say about global theater. There is no way to sort of extricate it from looking at contemporary theater. And so on Wednesday, I'll be looking at contemporary theater and some of the practices in the U.S., but also global contemporary theater. All right, I'll talk to you soon.